Hi, I'm Jay Reed. I'm a practicing psychotherapist in San Francisco, and today is the first video of what I intend to be several around the process of recovering from narcissistic abuse during one's childhood. And the focus for today will be on the psychology of the narcissistic parent who then goes on to abuse their child. And the purpose to start there is in essence, so we get to kind of know the enemy, as it were. How was the parent made up such that they had to sort of look at the child as less than, as often threatening to their own sense of fragile self-worth, and why they kind of, in essence, had to go out of their way to make their child feel worse than they did. And I think there are good reasons for that when we, take seriously the theory of narcissistic psychology. And my hope is that I'll be able to kind of explain some of that feels fairly accessible and hopefully resonates. If you've undergone something like this, hopefully it can resonate in a clarifying way that sort of implies it wasn't your fault, of course, but maybe sheds a light on what the abuser's kind of inner world, how it may have been made up. So, to begin with, the psychology of a narcissist has to begin with their inner sense of deep worthlessness. It is unbearable for the narcissist to acknowledge this, and instead of acknowledging it, even to themselves, they employ these antidotal measures. And I think of them as antidotal because they don't solve the problem, they just stave off its symptoms for a bit. At great cost, though, to the people around them. So the first aspect to the antidotal solution is just sort of flatly deny that they feel worthless, and in fact to insist the opposite, that they are in fact more important or more special or just plain better than others. And so they're certainly the opposite of worthless. They are full of worth, is what they consciously need to tell themselves. And the term for that in psychology land is a grandiose sense of self. The other part to the antidotal solution is the expectations that others are going to comply with this inflated view of themselves. And the term for that in the psychology world is entitlement. So they often will act coercively towards others, whether implicitly or explicitly, to garner that reflection back to them that they are in fact as grandiosely good as they need to think of themselves. Now, these two antidotes, or two aspects of their antidote to their worthlessness, require a ton of self-absorption and a ton of self-aggrandizement or self-boosting up. These are two traits which are not very flattering, right, in our culture. If it's widely known that, say, Joe is focused on himself and likes to kind of boast all the time or think of himself as better than others, he's not going to have a lot of friends, right? So the narcissist needs to guard against this from becoming widely known, that this is kind of how they are. And we'll get into how they go about doing that and how, unfortunately, this becomes the child's cross to bear. But so, given these two, the features I just laid out of this core sense of worthlessness, the antidotal grandiose sense of self, and sense of entitlement that others reflect that grandiose sense of self, it's not a far stretch for us to think of what happens when this kind of a person has a child. Now, they may think of themselves or have invested part of their grandiose sense of self as being sort of this perfect caregiver, and in that case, they may initially think, oh, the kid will sort of be a further compliment to who I am. But what happens in parenthood, as people know, a kid comes in this world and they're a bundle of needs. They require an adult who has love for them to meet those needs benignly, supportively, and in fact, lovingly. a narcissist is not motivated in those ways. I might submit that their worthlessness prevents them, sense of worthlessness prevents them from really cultivating, that kind of a set of feelings towards anyone, particularly themselves. So instead, what happens when they encounter their child is what they experience is instead an interruption to the processes they need to always be engaged in to maintain their sort of inflated sense of themselves. And these interruptions are not taken kindly by the narcissist, because what that means is when these antidotal processes get interrupted, the narcissist grows in their sense of worthlessness. I think a fair characterization of this is that, let's say a mother is extremely narcissistic. When she hears her baby crying because it wants to be fed, let's say, she may not think, oh good, I get to go minister to my child's needs and it makes me happy when I know my child's no longer hungry. She may instead think, my child thinks his needs are more important than mine, and that makes me feel more worthless, and I don't like that, etc. I don't like the child. We'll get into that. But it's a fundamentally different way of experiencing the child than a non-narcissistic parent. The narcissistic parent who's aware of how kind of aberrant, their attitude is towards their child, probably sees this as further evidence of their worthlessness and needs to kind of redouble their efforts to not feel as though this reveals anything bad about them, that in fact it's the child's fault. When the kid comes into the world, it's right. What it rightfully seeks is the need to be prioritized, loved, and supported, and yet it faces this terrible dilemma. The child of narcissistic parent faces this terrible dilemma that those very inborn needs constitute a psychological threat to the parent's tenuous efforts to maintain their own inflated self-esteem and stave off their worthlessness. So what happens when that inevitable disruption in the parent's sort of self-absorbing processes occurs, kids crying, kids has a dirty diaper, kid maybe wants attention, is that the parents got to restore their own ability to kind of focus on themselves. And they do that in a very unfortunate way, but an important way, one to understand for survivors who have gone through this. The first thing is often that the parent will perceive the child as the selfish one. It's the child's fault that they are interrupting the parent's sort of antidotal processes. The child is selfish. The child doesn't think of others. And this can really truly be felt and believed. The child is too needy. Secondly, if the second objective I think that happens when a narcissistic person has a child is they often will then try to relocate their own sense of worthlessness in that child. So they can see the child thinking of themselves. If they see the child thinking of him or herself as worthless, that allows the parent a reprieve from the worthlessness they're carrying around. It's a process called projective identification in the psychology world, where when one cannot bear a feeling in them, they sort of act. Well, they act in ways that coerce another person to sort of feel those feelings themselves, and then they have to act in ways to kind of keep that feeling in that other person. And what it does, it sort of allows them a relief or reprieve from the awful feeling they cannot bear, but they must continually kind of domineer the other person to make sure they are the bearer of those feelings that the narcissist cannot stand. So they do this in a lot of different ways. In the blog post this video is linked to, I highlight scenes from This Boy's Life with Robert De Niro and Leo DiCaprio, and you can see how he will find fairly innocuous things in his stepson, Leo DiCaprio, that become sort of distorted reasons why DiCaprio is so selfish, why he's no good, i.e. worthless. And De Niro, in this case, is trying to get DiCaprio to think of himself in the worthless way that De Niro doesn't want to acknowledge he thinks of himself. And two, to deflect from De Niro's own selfishness and see that in DiCaprio and get DiCaprio to sort of go along with that too. I highly recommend the movie, and if you have time and interest, checking out the blog, just kind of see how the movie really illustrates this process of narcissistic blaming. There are two requirements to be able to do this for a parent, right? It's so unnatural, so anti-parental. The Latin for parent is to bring forth. This is sort of to do the opposite, to smush when a narcissist parents in this regard. They need to have a lack of empathy, a profound lack of empathy, or the inability or unwillingness to consider or care about the cost to the blamed child's emotional well-being. And second, they have to possess the ability to be remorseless, that they have to have the conviction that the child deserves the treatment they're getting. So I hope that kind of sheds some light on kind of how a narcissist is built in general, and then how that psychology interfaces with parenthood in ways that kind of make trying to take care of a child inevitably disruptive to their own very, very fragile sense of self-esteem, the narcissist's fragile sense of self-esteem, which then results in abuse of the child for committing this sort of sin of interrupting their self-absorption. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and I hope everyone's staying healthy and safe during this very unprecedented and uncertain time for now with the coronavirus. And I look forward to future posts, video posts, where we can kind of engage more like this. Particularly the comments on the blogs have been helpful, and I intend to have at least a few sessions where some of the very pointed questions I'll take a stab at answering. And so I encourage those to continue coming, whether on the videos or on the blog posts. Thanks.